All right, hello, everybody. Looks like we have a lot of people still trickling in, so we're not going to wait too long for that because I don't want everybody who showed up on time to be penalized. But we'll give it another 60 seconds or so before we get rocking and rolling here. All right, everybody, I just got a bunch of comments that my audio is pretty choppy, so I got rid of the headphones and I'm using my computer audio. Probably sounds like I'm kind of far away, which is better than having choppy audio, but still not ideal. Let me know if it sounds any better, and if not, I will just call in from my phone. All right, we're gonna get going here. It looks like my audio is good. If for any reason during the webinar the audio seems to get choppy, go ahead and just submit it in the questions box and we'll see if we can take care of it. But I think we should be good to go. So I'm gonna share my screen and we're going to dive right in. All right. All right. So I want to get a quick check. Can everybody see my screen? Go ahead and submit a question. Just want to make sure I am not making this an audio only experience. Let me know if you can see this. All right, I think we're good. Everyone can see it. Okay. Well, we are going to pull back the curtains today. We are going to pull back the curtains today and we are going to talk about selling to the C-suite. So this is going to come back from the collective spirit experiences we have at Gong as a management team and how we approach it. And also we're going to pull back the curtains on how we do this internally, how we sell to C-suite executives internally here at Gong. You'll be able to take away many pieces of inspiration, tips, tricks, and strategies. You're going to walk out at the end of this webinar with a totally different strategy. So make sure you stay tuned for the very end of the webinar. This says we have one special giveaway for you at the end. We've actually got two special giveaways at the end. So go ahead, stay till the very end of the webinar. It's going to be exciting, and we'll make sure we cover it toward the end. So selling to the C-suite. Let's just start with calling out the elephant in the room here. Everybody's so eager to sell to the C-suite. We're all very eager to have a meeting with the C-suite executives or C-suite executives, but what we don't realize is it actually can be very dangerous. It's a two-edged sword. So on the one hand, if you play your cards right, you get a lot of control over the deal. The C-suite executive has a lot of authority to get a deal done. You can move the deal very quickly, and you can get it closed with a high degree of certainty if you play your cards right. But on the other hand, you've got one shot to get it right. You have one opportunity to make sure this goes well. And if you don't, if you slip up during this sales meeting, which is a very precious sales meeting, the executive is going to write you off forever, and more than likely your deal is going to go into a permanent grave. So if you're on this webinar, more than likely you found out about this webinar through the blog post that we wrote on LinkedIn, where we analyzed close to 40,000 B2B sales deals that were conducted with C-suite executives. And we found that the more questions you ask, the more discovery questions you ask, the less likely you are to actually close the deal. Now, that's not necessarily me saying do not ask questions, and it's not a prescription for you to say, well, all I have to do is ask 4 questions, which is where this peak is on the graph, and I'll automatically close the deal. The point to take away from this graph is we have been trained to sell to the C-suite incorrectly. We go to the C-suite with an information gathering mindset, and they have very little patience for that. So Here is how selling to the C-suite typically plays out if you're doing it incorrectly. There are three scenarios. There are three narratives that tend to happen here. Scenario one is you get kicked in the teeth. So if you read my blog post, that's exactly what happened to me at the very beginning of the article. You ask some generic line of questioning, and the executive has no patience for it and tells you to get out of the meeting, or they storm out, or they are otherwise visibly annoyed and your meeting just does not go well. So that is kind of like the worst case scenario here. It can feel very painful in the moment, but you'll end up learning something if that does happen to you. Scenario number two, which is kind of funny, is you get politely punted down the organization. So if you guys are familiar, or if everybody in attendance is familiar with the sitcom How I Met Your Mother, there's this funny scene where Barney is always introducing Ted to some girl at the bar, and he always says, "Have you met Ted?" And I just realized there's a typo on this, but no big deal. And that's the kind of thing that happens if you sell ineffectively to a C-suite executive. That's scenario number two, is they kind of feign interest, they say it looks really exciting, and they punt you down to somebody who has no authority, and now you're kind of stuck wallowing in middle management. And then there is scenario number three, which is you never got your foot in the door selling high in the organization. You never got access to the C-suite executive. And because you are handling your sales meetings in a certain way in the middle ranks, they are not going to introduce you to the C-suite executive, and they remain elusive. It's almost like they're Bigfoot. You almost question if they even exist. So all three of these scenarios, they end this exact same way, which is a stalled deal. And if you're a sales leader on the line today, what ends up happening is your pipeline remains stalled. You have many stalled deals. You over forecast, and most of them have to be written off. So the rest of this webinar my goal is to give you as much value as possible. My goal is to pull back the curtain. We're going to change the story. We're going to get you a seat at the executive table by having a strategic conversation at the C-suite level. So let's get right into it. Principle number one is the most important and also the most basic, which is tying your value proposition or your solution to a strategic topic, not a tactical topic. So here's an example of what this means. Here, I'm going to make it concrete. This is an example of what we do at Gong. If you're not familiar with Gong, we provide a platform that captures and analyzes sales conversations. And what we found during our first year and a half in the market or so is when we talked about coaching as the value of Gong, we would attract mid-level sales managers, which is not necessarily bad, but we got stuck with them. Coaching is a topic that usually mid-level sales managers or senior directors or even like team leads are interested in. And C-suite executives don't really see it as a strategic priority. They think of it as something they should do at some point in the future, but it doesn't really cross their mind as often as something a little more strategic and visceral might. So what we ended up doing is, especially if the company we're selling to is in a competitive space, we tie Gong to the competitive differentiation value category. And later in this webinar, I'm going to walk you through step by step how we tie Gong to how we can help C-suite executives differentiate from competitors. But before we get into exactly how we do it, let's just talk about why we did it. The first one is it attracts VP level and C-suite executives. It's discussed frequently at executive meetings, and it's thought about every day at a visceral level, not just an intellectual level, but an emotional, visceral level. And when you can tell a story that ties your solution to something that is more strategically important to the executive, even if you don't change the product or the service, now you're going to move up in the organization. So this is probably worth screenshotting and just keeping it on your desktop and reviewing every so often, review every month or 3 months, just to remind yourself. This is kind of the takeaway from principle number one, is the language you use in your sales meetings will get you delegated to the person that you sound like. And that applies both up in the organization as well as down in the organization. So if you're lucky enough to start at the C-suite and you start talking about something tactical or something product related, you talk about your product features, they're going to think, hey, this guy sounds like Ted, or this gal sounds like Ted. And they are going to delegate you down to that person, which is typically going to be somebody in the middle ranks who is not going to have much decision-making authority. However, the opposite is also true. If you're not lucky enough to get in at the C-suite and you have to start in the middle management ranks, if you're talking about strategic topics that middle managers know are important to their C-suite executives, it's no guarantee, but they are much more likely to introduce you to their boss because it will almost impress their boss. They'll think to themselves that this guy or this gal is talking about something that I know is high priority to my boss, and they won't feel obligated to introduce you, but they will be much more likely to introduce you. You've removed the resistance and the emotional barriers that are preventing them from introducing you to their boss. So that's principle number one. I would start by brainstorming how you could possibly tie your solution to a must-have strategic priority rather than a nice-to-have tactical one that does not have any urgency behind it. So now we're going to unpack and we're going to go dive into the rabbit hole a little bit further here. We are going to talk about the 4-step framework for structuring your sales meetings for selling to the C-suite. So here it is at a high level. We're going to unpack this. This is another thing that I would recommend taking a screenshot of. We're going to dive into each one of these 4 steps. So I'm not going to recite them here. I'll leave this up for just another second, and then we will change slides. So step 1, as you saw on the previous slide, is start with a nexus. You might be thinking to yourself, what the hell is a nexus? A nexus is a polarizing insight that changes how your customer thinks and feels about a key opportunity or a key problem and can eventually be tied back to your solution. So if you're familiar with the challenger sale model, the reframe and the 6-step commercial teaching pitch is a type of nexus. They are not synonymous. A reframe and a nexus are not necessarily the same thing. A reframe is a type of nexus. The rest of your sales pitch is going to be built around the nexus that you come up with here. And the final note I'll say about nexus before I give you an example of what this looks like is it's best to make it polarizing. The insight that you deliver should attract some people and almost repel other people. Good sales messages and good marketing messages do not attract everybody. They attract your best customers and they repel people who do not believe what you believe. So here's an example of a nexus we use at Gong, and this goes back to how we sell competitive differentiation instead of coaching. We start with what we have identified as a change in the world. If any of you have read Andy Raskin's blog post about the best sales presentation I've ever seen, that is a great example of a nexus as well. But the nexus we use at Gong when we are selling to a company that's in a highly competitive space is we say the battleground for competitive differentiation has shifted. It has moved from having a unique product to what your sellers say, do, and write during the sales process. That is where the perception of difference is created. Now, it's important to get this right. The rest of your pitch is going to pivot off the nexus. So step 2 is educating them out of their status quo. This is where you springboard off of your nexus and you start tearing apart their status quo, making it feel unsafe without violating any tact or blaming them for making a decision that got them into this situation to begin with. So the way you want to do this is by introducing external changes or trends that are threatening their status quo. If it's something external, now they can put the blame on that instead of saying, I screwed up, I made a bad decision, and the status quo is no longer livable because of me. So these trends, which I'll get into some examples, they must be related to or support your nexus. Otherwise, you're doing consulting for free. And they should focus on tearing down A more than they focus on building up B, which I'll explain what that means in just a minute. And what that creates is loss aversion. And loss aversion is this idea that people will work twice as hard to avoid loss than they will to gain a benefit. So how do you do that? This goes back to the third bullet point in a couple slides. This is straight out from the Challenger Customer. If you guys have read that, if you have not, I highly recommend reading that. But what they talk about is most sellers and most marketers are focused on building up point B. If you think of any solution, it is designed to get you from point A, which is your status quo, to point B, which is the benefit or the end result that your product is poised to deliver. And most of us are talking about point B too much. We're selling too much on benefits. But the problem is you can have the most crisp benefit statement in the world, but it is not going to land if you have not built the context of tearing apart their status quo, which is point A. So the real power in having a sales meeting with a C-suite executive, or the type of sales meeting that's going to drive urgency with them, is if you spend most of the time talking about how the status quo that they have in front of them is no longer viable and they absolutely have to move. If you do that, they'll be twice as hard to work for you, or they will work twice as hard to implement your solution than if you just sell benefits. Okay, all of this is going to become more concrete as we go, so just bear with me here. I'm going to introduce you to the exact pitch we use at Gong, as well as another example, but we're going to get through this 4-part framework first. And step 3 is introducing the new approach. So step 1, just as a quick summary, is we introduce the nexus, which is a polarizing insight. Step 2 is we go through educating the buyer out of their status quo and building that urgency with loss aversion. And step 3 is introducing the new approach. And this, if you get your nexus right, and if you get step 2, which is educating them out of their status quo right, step 3 is going to be very easy. It is just introducing the behavior you want them to implement, or the philosophy change that you want them to implement. So I'll show you what that looks like in just a couple minutes here. And finally, step 4 is you end the meeting by telling a before and after customer story. Now, I'm going through this kind of fast. I want to pause and make a quick point here. This is not a pitch. This 4-step framework is designed for you to have a strong two-way conversation, not just go through a 60-minute monologue where the executive sits back and listens. That said, you also can't go to the other extreme, which is interrogating the executive with information that they already know. But that said, that caveat said, let's get into step 4, which is telling a before and after customer story. So the key to that is telling the before part of the customer story. And the way most sellers tell customer stories is they just tell the after part of the story, which is not even a story. It's a data dump or it's a proof point. And the problem with a proof point is somebody has to be convinced of the problem and the solution for a proof point to resonate. If they're convinced of both of those things, now a proof point becomes very handy. But they are not a persuasive tool. They are something that, quote unquote, puts the nail in the coffin after somebody has already been persuaded. So the real value in telling a customer story is telling the before part of the story. You should be telling a story that is targeted so that your buyer, your C-suite executive, can quote unquote see themselves in the story. And this will enable them to come to their own self-discovery rather than you telling them that they have a problem. And I want to highlight an organization that does this really well, which is Alcoholics Anonymous. They are, quote unquote, serving a clientele that has more denial than probably any population on earth. And so they can't tell somebody they have a problem. They have to lead that person to their own self-discovery that they have a problem through the use of stories. And what you will not see on Alcoholics Anonymous website is a customer story that is used as a proof point, which is what we have here on the left. You will not see AA changed my life, my career is back on track, my family life is better than ever. That'll only resonate with somebody who's already admitted to having a problem. Instead, what they do is you'll see customer testimonial quotes that web visitors who have a drinking problem can see themselves in, and it will allow them to come to their own discovery that they do indeed have a problem. So you'll see things like, it started with just a few drinks on the weekends. That soon became a few drinks every day, and eventually I could not unplug at night without having at least a few drinks. So when you tell a story like that, now you can start to go into the after. They've come to their own self-discovery that they have a problem, and you have used a customer story as a persuasive tool rather than just a proof point. All right, so we're actually going to dive into that principle a little bit deeper here. Principle number 3 for selling to the C-suite is build your business case with customer stories and not ROI calculations. So here's why. When you go into a C-suite meeting, and this is not even just applicable to C-suite, this is applicable to most of the people you find yourself selling to. What happens when you calculate ROI is it puts the buyer in a mindset where they are evaluating your assumptions, and for the most part, they're going to be arguing with your assumptions rather than sizing up the ROI and thinking hard and intellectually about whether or not they can create those returns. So at best, most C-suite executives are going to think it's pretty unattributable, and at worst, they're going to think you have no business acumen, they're going to write you off, and likely they're going to punt you down to somebody lower in the organization, because one more time you get punted down or delegated to the person you sound like. And if you sound like somebody who doesn't know what they're talking about when it comes to building a business case, you are going to be delegated accordingly. So the best way to do this is to use relevant, and I would highlight the word relevant because they need to see themselves in these stories. Use relevant before and after stories to build your business case rather than using an ROI calculator. So if it's targeted, if it's tailored to the problem they're dealing with, now they're going to be able to see how other companies have built the business case, and it's going to become much more believable, and they'll be able to sink their teeth into it. So feel free to take a screenshot of this if you want to kind of keep it as this inspiration. This is an example case study that we use over here at Gong, and I have anonymized the client that we've used at their request. But we will go ahead and move forward into tying this all together, and here's what our framework for selling to the C-suite looks like here at Gong. So step 1, the nexus. We start with the insight. The battleground for competitive differentiation has shifted. Where it was once having a unique product, what helped you win the competitive battle, it's now sales conversations. What your sellers say, do, and write in the sales process is where the perception of difference is created. That leads us to educating the buyer out of their status quo. Now we're going to springboard from our nexus and start to build pain by introducing trends that threaten their status quo. So notice that these are very relevant to the nexus we just covered. Every industry is exploding with competing products. The MarTech industry is just one example of that. Back in 2011, which is the graph we're looking at the left, the marketing technology landscape had 150 vendors. Today, they have over 5,000 vendors, and the same explosion of competition is happening in every B2B category. And having a unique product is very unlikely to cut through that clutter. Sales conversations are going to be where the difference is created. Now, the next trend that we introduce is not only has this happened and the world has become increasingly competitive, it's actually going to get worse. You're going to have to deal with more competition and more clutter that your buyers are going to have to sort through. And the reason is global trade is skyrocketing. Competitors from foreign companies are going to come, or competitors from foreign countries are going to come into your country and try to take customers from you. You're not just going to have to deal with competitors that are in your own country. You're going to have to deal with a global marketplace, which leads to more products, which leads to it being even more difficult to discern the difference between all these products. And what these external trends create is what we call the twin effect. So selling two products, especially in the B2B space, is a little bit like telling twins apart. I should say differentiating products is a bit like telling twins apart. To you, the parent, you can understand the differences between two twins very easily. You're with your twins all the time. To use the analogy, you're with your product all the time. You probably use your product every day. You can tell the difference between your product and your competitor's product instantly. But it's the first time your buyers have seen the two products. And it's probably the only time. They're not going to take multiple demos. And as a result of all this proliferation of competition and alternative products, they conclude, even though there are differences, that these products are more or less the same. They look like twins. They're practically identical. Okay, these products are at parity. And what this ends up leading to, and this is how we make our pitch emotional, we tell a story, we introduce a narrative that will seem very familiar to the customer. What this leads to is the customer concludes that these products are more or less the same. They create the dreaded comparison spreadsheet where you one up your competitor on feature A, they match you and one up you on feature B. And as that cycle continues, eventually the customer just concludes these products are at parity. They have some advantages here and this one has some advantages here, but now this is just going to come down to price. And the customer starts grinding you down on price. And that is what happens when you lead your differentiation strategy with product uniqueness rather than sales conversations. So that was step two. That was tearing apart their status quo. We started with step one, which is the nexus of the competitive or the landscape, the battleground for competitive differentiation has shifted from product uniqueness to what your sellers do during sales conversations. We introduced step two, which is these external trends that threaten their status quo. We're alerting the C-suite executive to threats and opportunities that might be sitting right under their nose undetected. And finally, once we've created the context by tearing apart their status quo, we introduce the new approach. Instead of differentiating with your product, it is nothing more than a ticket to play the game. You are going to win with how you sell, not necessarily what you sell. This is our step three at Gong. And if you'll notice, that's a polarizing insight. Some people are going to wholeheartedly believe in that philosophy, and some people are going to almost be offended by that philosophy. And that's actually what we're going for. Of course, we don't want to offend anybody, but we want some people to wholeheartedly agree and some people to just, never buy in. That's actually a sign that you've got an educational pitch that is provocative enough to get a C-suite executive's attention. And finally, we wrap this up with a before and after story. So this is an anonymized story because a competitive case study is pretty sensitive. So we have our client anonymized here, but we start with the before part. This is like the part of the story that the customer should be able to see themselves in and come to their own self-discovery that they've got a problem. And anybody who's in a highly competitive space should be able to identify with this. This is why it works so well. I knew something had to change when the customer told me, I've never seen two products look more identical. This will come down to price. Even though I know we have a very differentiated product, the customer was unable to see it because we were unable to communicate our unique value during the sales process. Now is when we build the business case with a before and after case study. We start out by listing their status quo and the metrics associated with that. 20% competitive win rate and a pretty high discount rate, which means customers were grinding them down on price because there was no perception of unique value. And after working with Gong, we 2.5x their competitive win rates. It went from 20 to 70%. And the average discount rate has decreased from 13 to 18%, which means we're selling on value rather than letting the customer grind us down. Business case in this way, as long as it's targeted and relevant, that is all the customer needs. I'm going to say something that many people may disagree with, but people do not buy because of ROI. ROI and business case is just a way for them to justify logically that they're making the right decision. And if you present a before and after business case that is targeted and relevant to their situation, they're going to justify the purchase without arguing with all of the assumptions that your ROI calculator might be riddled with. And finally, we would end, this is more of like a marketing collateral example. I don't think our salespeople would use a slide like this, but we end the before and after case study with the after quote. Our competitors don't stand a chance anymore. While they're pushing product during their sales conversations, we're having strategic conversations, and we practically box out the competitors at the beginning of the sales process. So here's one last example. That was an example of the 4-step framework we use at Gong. I'll give you a very short version, a 1-slide version of another one. Imagine you're selling formaldehyde-free furniture. So for the unfamiliar, formaldehyde is a chemical that was historically used in the furniture making process that could lead to cancer and other diseases. Now, the wrong way to do this would be to sell on benefits, which is over here at the left, which is probably going to get you delegated down in the organization. So imagine you're selling this furniture to a retail executive. If you start by explaining what you do and its benefits and how your customers are going to buy it in droves, it's not really going to resonate. But if you can bring education to the C-suite with loss aversion weaved into that pitch, now you're going to start to sound like them, and they're going to bring you to the executive table. So here's what a good pitch would sound like, which is over here on the right. American citizens are becoming more health conscious and wary of dangerous chemicals. In fact, Google search volume for formaldehyde-free furniture is up 600% in 2 years. There's our external trend that's threatening the status quo. We help retailers make good on this opportunity by supplying formaldehyde-free furniture. Now, this is obviously a very truncated version of the pitch. There would be a lot more to it, but you can see the stark difference. On the left, we're very product and benefit oriented, and over here on the right, we are talking about something that the C-suite should be aware of, but maybe they are not, and they will appreciate you for that. So here's one of the last takeaways. I would also take a screenshot of this, return to it every few months, make sure that your sales calls are being run accordingly. This is the last thing we'll cover before we get into a couple free prizes in the end. The way you know your sales meetings are going well with the C-suite is, are they getting as much out of the sales call or more than you are? Or is it just a data transfer? Is it a transfer of their situation's information to you and your product information over to them? If that's all it is, you're probably going to either get kicked in the teeth, delegated down, or you just won't get access to the C-suite to begin with here. So I've got 2 offers before we wrap this up. We're going to start with the easy one, and then we're going to end with one that is a little more amazing. The first one is for the best 2 shout outs on LinkedIn about this webinar, we'll review your sales deck or pitch for free. So the only caveats, there are 2 caveats for you to qualify, is you have to tag Gong and you have to tag me and include your takeaway, include what you learned from the webinar, and try to give it a unique angle. You get bonus points if you decided to take any screenshots throughout this, and use those in your status update. So we internally, our management team, we have set aside time for this. Myself, our VP of sales, and our VP of marketing will review your sales deck, talking points, or pitch, or any other messaging vehicle you want us to review for free. That's for the 2 best shout outs. The second thing is, if you read the blog post that drove most of the attendance to this webinar, the quick backstory is we analyzed a bunch of sales calls with AI. These are recorded sales calls with artificial intelligence to understand what the best salespeople do according to data. The problem with these blog posts is it's generalized information across many sales teams. What works for you might end up being a little bit unique. So for 10 of you in attendance, we will run a custom analysis just like you see in our Gong Lab series blog post for you for free. I want to give a quick caveat. I would love to do this for everybody, but it actually requires a few people from our data science team to be able to pull this off. So while I would love to do this for everybody, we can only do it for 10 of you in attendance. Here's how to qualify for this. Oops, skipped over that. So if you want to take advantage of this free analysis and identify exactly what your best reps are doing according to the rest of your salespeople, according to actually data, here's what to do. Email me, here's my email address, chris.orlob@gong.io with the subject line of Gong Labs, and include the following in your email. What's your company name? How many salespeople do you have? And what do you use to make calls? Whether it's a web conferencing platform like GoToMeeting, Zoom, WebEx, or a telephony provider, or some sort of dialer like InsideSales.com or Outreach or SalesLoft. So if you send us an email, if you send us this email, you will be qualified to be one of the 10 people in attendance for us to run this custom analysis. We'll give you this nice report at the end telling you exactly what your best reps are doing differently than everybody else, including the number of questions they ask, their talk to listen ratio, the topics they discuss, when they talk about pricing. There's a lot that we can cover here, but we can only do it for 10 of you. So that leads us to the end. Man, this was a webinar to remember, mainly because I jumped in the wrong meeting room at the beginning and had to walk around and find the right meeting room. So I hope everybody had a good sense of humor about that. Sorry if there was kind of like this awkward 2 minutes there where I had to figure out where I was supposed to be presenting. Thank you so much for your patience. I hope you got a lot of value out of this. I'm not gonna lie, that took me out of my flow a little bit there, so hopefully I picked up my steam again toward the middle, but I would love to field a few questions and answers as we go here. We still have a little bit of time, so I will keep an eye on the questions box and we'll field them from there. Okay, we have a ton of questions. I got a comment, the meeting room mix-up was funny. Yes, I am human like the rest of you. I'm glad that this person thought I was cool as a cucumber because my face was probably bright red while that was happening. Super glad I decided to not show video because you guys would have all been able to see that. All right, let's get to some of the questions. What was the email again? Okay, I will go back. It is chris.orlob@gong.io. Sorry about that. All right. Got a lot of good feedback about that. This was a great webinar, even though we had that big mix up. Okay, we've got a bunch coming in here. So how would you approach selling into an industry that is known to be technology laggards? They are generally opposed to new tech and are skeptical of it as well. Okay, so there are a couple points I would say here. The first one is you need to approach your conversations from a loss aversion standpoint more than anybody else, because they are not looking to buy benefits at all. They're not looking to transform their business. They are looking to maintain their status quo. So the first thing would be follow what you learned in this webinar. The second thing is you are going to need to have relevant reference clients for them. So laggards by definition are people who do not want to go first, and they want to talk to people that are relevant to them in their industry, and ideally people that were dealing with the same problem as them before they can feel comfortable moving in that direction. So while I can't say I'm an absolute professional at selling to laggards, that would be a webinar in itself. The two things I can tell you are sell loss aversion, number one, and number two, line up relevant customer references. If you do not have relevant customer references, then I would argue you might not yet be in a position where it's relevant to sell to laggards. Okay, so the next question is prospecting to the C-suite. Can all of these apply to outbound? The answer is yes. It's going to require messaging prowess in the sense that you're going to have to truncate everything. So here's a quick story. I was just meeting with our CEO a couple days ago, and he said when he gets prospecting emails, he immediately forwards it to the person that deals with the issue that they're talking about. And this goes back to step one that we covered in this webinar, which is tie your solution to a strategic problem. If your outbound prospecting is tied to something the executive either doesn't care about or is handled lower in the organization, they're either going to ignore the email or they're going to delegate you down. But if you can craft an email that is targeted to a strategic issue, if you can lead with a crisp, concrete, concise insight, and maybe even sprinkle a very concise sentence or pitch about loss aversion, then you're going to have a much better chance of making that work. The point is, everything that we covered in this webinar is applicable to prospecting, but you have to be much more concise about it. So the next question is there a process you use to build your nexus? Is there a nexus for every business? So I'm going to answer the second part of that first. The answer is yes. Every business that is successfully generating revenue, by definition, has an opportunity for a nexus. The only business that does not have a possible nexus is a business that's failing or never got off the ground to begin with. Now, I wish I could tell you the step-by-step formula for finding your nexus, but the hard work behind following the nexus or discovering your nexus is you've got to understand your market very, very deeply. So if you have a product marketing team, you're going to want to lean on them. Get them to conduct buyer persona interviews. If you don't have a product marketing team, immerse yourself in the market. Talk to buyers, talk to customers, go to trade shows. Make sure you know everything you possibly can about your customer's business, and eventually you're going to find a nexus if you're trying to find one. The second thing I would say about discovering your nexus is it's not the first nexus that's going to work. It is the 30th one. We are constantly refining our own nexus and our own messaging over here at Gong. So the takeaway there is don't try to find the perfect nexus, try to find a better nexus than you already have. Start with something, be willing to get kicked in the teeth, refine, and eventually when you get to version 10 or 20 or 30, you're going to have something that resonates. But there's no easy step-by-step way to find this stuff out except for understanding your market very deeply and trying things and failing and getting kicked in the teeth. Or if you have a product marketing team, let them get kicked in the teeth. Okay. Okay, so that's all the questions that we're going to have time for today. I'll give you one more offer. If you have additional questions, I can't promise I'm going to be answering all of these because I've already looked at my inbox from my phone and I have a ton. But my email's up on the deck. Go ahead and shoot me an email if you have more specific questions. I will do my best to respond to all of them. If I can't, please understand that I just didn't have time. And again, for you who want to have their own sales teams conversations analyzed, custom analysis from our data science team, email me with a subject line of Gong Labs, include the information you see up here. And thank you so much, everybody, for being a good sport. I am going to go tell everybody what happened here just to give everybody else a good laugh. And once again, thank you so much. We're going to send the deck as well as the recording through an email either later today or tomorrow. Thank you so much.